For 20 years, I lived with a man who told me the scratching sounds in our walls were just the restless ghosts of the Scottish Highlands, but the truth was much more terrifying. The ghosts were actually breathing, eating, and waiting right beneath my feet. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable, happy listening. My name is Janet, and for most of my life, I was just a quiet woman living in a big, cold house, trusting a man who used my love as a blindfold. Julian was a doctor, a man of prestige, and I was the wife who stayed in the background, drinking the nerve tonic he prepared for me every night because I thought he was trying to protect me from my own fragile mind. I spent 2 decades in a fog, listening to the house groan and whisper, believing his lies that the Victorian estate was haunted by spirits who refused to leave. The dark truth was that the medicine wasn't for my health. It was a weapon used to keep me sleeping while my husband lived a second life right under the floorboards of our parlor. I remember the exact night the fog was so thick it swallowed the trees, and for some reason, a tiny voice in my head told me to pour my tea into the garden instead of drinking it. As the hours passed, the heavy, drugged sleep never came, and for the first time, I saw the man I loved for who he really was. I watched from the shadows as Julian crept out of bed, carrying a tray of fresh fruit and expensive chocolates, his eyes shining with a strange, hungry excitement I had never seen in our 20 years of marriage. I followed him down the long, freezing hallway, my feet silent on the wood, and watched as he pulled back our heavy rug to reveal a hidden door. The tension was a cold hand around my throat as I watched him disappear into the earth, and when I leaned over the opening, I didn't hear ghosts. I heard the soft, sweet giggle of a little boy and the tired voice of a woman singing a lullaby in the dark. My heart broke into a million pieces because I realized that while I was upstairs grieving the children I could never have, Julian was downstairs keeping a family he had stolen from the light. I saw a woman who looked like a ghost of myself, holding a child with Julian's piercing blue eyes, and I realized I wasn't the queen of this house. I was just the lid on a coffin. The air felt like poison as I stared into that secret world, knowing that if Julian looked up and saw me, I would never see the sun again. I stood at the edge of that dark, yawning hole in the floor, watching the man I called my husband hand a silk ribbon to a woman who was living in a cage made of expensive wood in silence. The most terrifying thing wasn't the secret family itself, but the way Julian moved among them with a calm, practiced tenderness that made my skin crawl. He wasn't a monster who hid in the shadows. He was a man who had turned the shadows into a home. The tension was a razor blade against my throat as I watched him sit on a velvet sofa that had disappeared from our guest wing years ago, realizing that my entire life upstairs was just a hollow stage for the real drama happening in the dirt. I saw the woman, Sarah, lean her head on his shoulder with a look of exhausted devotion, her eyes fixed on a wall of painted windows that showed a fake summer garden, a cruel trick to make her believe she wasn't buried 6 feet deep. My breathing was shallow and jagged, every tiny creak of the house feeling like a gunshot in the silence, as I realized the haunting Julian had described for 20 years was just the muffled echo of this woman's footsteps and the boy's innocent laughter. The dark truth hit me like a physical blow. Every time I complained about the cold drafts or the strange smells, Julian would hold me and whisper that I was just sensitive to the spirits, all while he was likely planning what color to paint the walls of his underground palace. I looked at the boy, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, playing with a set of silver soldiers that belonged to my own father, and the rage that sparked in my chest was hotter than any fever. I wanted to scream, to rip the floorboards up with my bare hands, and demand to know how he could look me in the eye every morning while keeping a second heart beating in the dark. But the slow burn of my survival instinct told me to stay silent, to be the ghost he thought I was, because the silver carving knife Julian used to slice the fruit for the boy was the same one he used to cut our Sunday roast with a loving smile. The tension reached a breaking point when Julian suddenly looked up toward the ceiling, his eyes narrowing as if he could sense my shadow hovering above him, and for a heartbeat, our gazes almost met through the cracks in the wood. I scrambled back into the darkness of the parlor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and hid behind the heavy velvet curtains just as the sound of his footsteps began to climb the stone stairs. I realized then that I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was a witness to a crime that was built out of my own life's blood, and if I didn't find a way to outsmart the doctor, the next scratching sound in the walls would be my own fingers trying to claw my way out of the earth. I stood in the suffocating darkness of the parlor, listening to the heavy thud of the trapdoor closing, and realized that my husband didn't just share a bed with me, he shared a grave. The sound of the lock clicking into place was like a hammer hitting a nail into a coffin, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying because I now knew exactly what that silence was hiding. I stood perfectly still as Julian walked past my hiding spot, his footsteps heavy and confident, the whistling of a cheerful tune cutting through the air like a serrated blade. He sounded happy, a man satisfied with his work, while I felt like my entire world had been hollowed out, leaving nothing but a thin shell of a woman. The dark truth was that every "I love you" he had whispered to me was a lie used to keep the lid on his secret, and every time he told me I looked tired, he was really just checking to see if his drugs were working. The tension in the room was electric, a cold current that made the hair on my arms stand up as I watched his shadow stretch across the hallway, long and distorted like a monster from a nightmare. I waited until I heard the bedroom door click shut before I dared to move, my legs feeling like lead as I crept toward the kitchen to find a light. My mind was racing, a chaotic storm of fire and ice, wondering how Sarah and that little boy survived in a world without sun, and how many other ghosts Julian had collected in his long career of pretending to be a healer. I realized then that the Victorian estate wasn't a home. It was a museum of stolen lives, and I was just the curator of the upper floors, kept in the dark while the real business happened in the basement. The slow burn of my terror began to turn into a sharp, jagged edge of resolve because I knew that if I stayed, I would eventually end up down there too, or worse, I would simply disappear into the Highland mist like so many others he had mentioned in passing. I reached for the telephone, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely grip the receiver, but the line was dead, not just silent, but physically cut, a clean snip that told me Julian had been prepared for the day I finally stopped drinking his tea. The tension reached a sickening peak when I turned around and saw him standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his silk robe flowing behind him like a shroud, his eyes fixed on the empty teacup I had left on the counter. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, the way a scientist looks at a lab rat that refuses to follow the maze, and the smile he gave me was the coldest thing I had ever seen. He asked me why I was still awake, his voice a smooth, oily purr that made me want to scream, and as he stepped into the light, I saw that he was still holding the silver carving knife from the cellar. In that moment, the movie star husband I had worshipped for 20 years vanished, and I was left staring at a predator who had spent his whole life building a cage big enough for two families, but only small enough for one truth. Julian looked at me with a face so calm it made my blood turn to ice, and that's when I realized the man I married didn't have a heart. He had a clockwork engine that only ran on control. The tension in the kitchen was a physical weight, thick and suffocating, as he stood there blocking the only exit with that silver knife still glinting in his hand. He didn't ask me what I saw, and he didn't try to make an excuse, because in his mind, he was the king of this castle, and I was just another piece of furniture he had decided to rearrange. The dark truth was that he had been waiting for this moment, testing my loyalty with every drugged cup of tea, and now that I had finally refused his medicine, the mask was falling away to reveal a monster who was bored of playing house. He took a slow step toward me, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and asked if I was feeling confused again, his voice dripping with a fake, oily pity that made me want to vomit. I backed away until my spine hit the cold, hard edge of the stove, my hands searching blindly for anything to defend myself with, while the silence of the house seemed to scream with the voices of the people trapped beneath us. I realized then that Julian didn't fear the police or the neighbors. He only feared losing the perfect, silent world he had built in the dirt, and I was the only person left who could knock it all down. The slow burn of the night had reached its boiling point, and the air felt electric, like the moment before a lightning strike, as he told me that Sarah and the boy were happier than I could ever be because they didn't have to deal with the messy, loud reality of the outside world. He spoke about them like they were pets or prize-winning roses he had grown in the dark, and the pride in his voice was so twisted it made my head spin with a dizzying rage. I looked at the knife and then at his eyes, those cold, blue eyes that had once looked at me with what I thought was love, and I saw the absolute void where a soul should have been. The tension snapped when he reached out to touch my hair, his fingers cold as a corpse, and told me that maybe it was time for me to join them downstairs so we could finally be a complete family. The dark truth hit me like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't going to kill me yet, he was going to collect me, adding me to his underground gallery of broken women until the upper floors of the house were finally as empty and haunted as he always claimed they were. I felt a scream building in my throat, a sound that had been buried for 20 years, but I forced it down, knowing that if I let it out now, the door to the cellar would be the last thing I ever saw. I had to be smarter than him, faster than him, and twice as cruel, because the man standing in front of me had spent decades practicing how to keep a secret, and I only had one night to blow it all apart. The air in the kitchen was so heavy I could barely breathe, and as Julian took another step closer, I realized that the man who had shared my bed for 20 years was now the predator who wanted to bury me alive. The dark truth was that he didn't see me as a person anymore. I was just a broken toy that needed to be stored in the dark with the rest of his collection. My fingers finally brushed against the heavy iron handle of the cast iron skillet on the stove, and I felt a sudden, sharp spark of hope in the middle of my terror. The tension was a screaming siren in my ears as he reached out with his free hand, his voice whispering that the cellar was warm, quiet, and safe, as if he were inviting me to a holiday instead of a prison. I knew that if he touched me, I would lose my chance, so I swung the heavy pan with every ounce of strength I had left, fueled by 2 decades of stolen dreams and drugged nights. The sound of metal hitting his temple was a dull, sickening thud that echoed through the empty house, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to stop as his cold, blue eyes went wide with total shock. He stumbled back, the silver carving knife clattering to the floor, and I didn't wait to see if he would get up. I grabbed the knife and bolted toward the parlor, my heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to break free. The slow burn of my fear had turned into a wildfire of pure adrenaline, and as I reached the heavy Persian rug, I ripped it aside to reveal the wooden trapdoor that held the secret of my life. The tension reached a fever pitch as I heard Julian let out a low, guttural growl from the kitchen, the sound of a beast that had finally been poked, and I knew I only had seconds before he reached me. I pulled the heavy brass ring, and the door groaned open to reveal the stone stairs leading down into the yellow light of the hidden world. I didn't care about the danger anymore. I only cared about the woman and the child who were breathing the same poisonous lies I had been fed for years. As I descended into the warmth of the cellar, I saw Sarah standing at the bottom, her face pale and her eyes filled with a terror that mirrored my own, and I realized that we were 2 halves of the same broken heart. The dark truth was that Julian had built this cage for both of us, but he had forgotten that even ghosts can fight back when they have nothing left to lose. I grabbed Sarah's hand, feeling the thinness of her skin, and told her that the spirits were gone and that we were leaving the house before the moon went down. The tension was a crushing weight as we heard Julian's heavy footsteps reaching the top of the stairs, his shadow stretching down into the cellar like a giant hand reaching for its property, and I knew that the real battle for our lives was about to happen in the very place he thought he was king. The yellow light of the hidden room felt oily and thick, like it was trying to stick to my skin and keep me trapped there forever. The dark truth was that this wasn't a home. It was a museum of stolen moments, filled with furniture that had vanished from my life upstairs, now repurposed to build a fake reality for a woman and a child who didn't know the sun. The tension reached a screaming point as Julian's shadow hit the stone floor at the bottom of the stairs, looking like a dark stain spreading across the room. He didn't come down running. He walked slowly, each step deliberate and heavy, because he knew there was nowhere for us to go in this windowless tomb. I stood in front of Sarah and the boy, holding the silver carving knife in front of me with a hand that refused to stop shaking, while my mind raced through every exit I had ever seen in the house. I saw the way Sarah looked at Julian, not with hatred, but with a terrifying, hollow kind of love that made me realize how deep his poison had gone into her soul. She whispered his name like he was a savior, even as he looked at her with the cold, calculating eyes of a man checking his inventory. The slow burn of the nightmare reached a new level when the boy reached out for Julian's hand, and I had to realize that to this child, the monster was the only father he had ever known. The tension was a cold wire pulling tighter and tighter around my heart as Julian stopped at the bottom step, his face bruised and his eyes burning with a quiet, lethal rage. He told me that I had ruined the balance of our lives, and that now he would have to find a way to make sure I never spoke a word to anyone outside these walls ever again. The dark truth was that he didn't need to kill us to destroy us. He just had to keep us here until our memories of the outside world faded into nothing but gray fog. I looked at Sarah and told her that the garden she saw on the wall was a lie, that the sun was actually rising just a few feet above our heads, and for a second, I saw a spark of something like fire in her eyes. The tension snapped when Julian lunged forward, his hands reaching for my neck, and I realized that the only way to save these people was to break the one thing he loved more than us, his perfect secret control. I dodged his grip and grabbed a heavy crystal lamp from the side table, smashing it against the fake window, the glass shattering to reveal the cold, gray stone of the foundation behind it. The sound was like a thunderclap in the small room, and as the boy began to cry, the illusion of the happy home died right in front of us. Julian roared in frustration, a sound that wasn't human anymore, and as he turned to face me, I saw that the master of the house was finally losing his mind because his playthings were no longer following the script. We were trapped in a box of his making, but the dark truth was that the walls were closing in on him just as much as they were on us, and I knew that if we didn't get out in the next few minutes, the cellar would become a grave for all four of us. The air in the cellar turned freezing as the fake world Julian had built began to crumble under the weight of his own madness. The tension was a thick, invisible cord tightening around my lungs as I watched him scramble to pick up the broken pieces of the crystal lamp, his hands shaking with a desperate need to fix the illusion I had just shattered. The dark truth was that Julian didn't just want a second family. He wanted to be the only god in a world he could completely manipulate, and seeing the cold stone wall behind his garden was more painful to him than the blow I had dealt to his head. I saw Sarah pull the boy closer to her, her eyes darting from the jagged glass on the floor to the husband, who was now foaming at the mouth with a quiet, terrifying fury. I realized then that the only weapon I had left was the truth, so I started screaming it at the top of my lungs, telling Sarah about the sun, the wind, and the 20 years of my life that had been stolen by the man she thought was her protector. The slow burn of her realization was a beautiful, tragic thing to watch as the fog in her eyes finally began to clear, replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of betrayal that mirrored my own. Julian saw the change in her face, and his expression shifted from panic to a cold, lethal resolve. He stopped trying to fix the lamp and turned toward us, his shadow growing long and monstrous against the cellar walls. The tension reached a shivering peak when he reached into the pocket of his silk robe and pulled out a small glass vial, the same nerve tonic he had used to keep me in a daze for 2 decades. He told us that if we wouldn't be happy in his world, we would simply sleep through the rest of it, and he began to move towards Sarah with a needle that glinted like a silver tooth in the dim light. I knew that if he touched her with that poison, she would never wake up again, and the boy would grow up in a tomb with a monster for a father. The dark truth hit me that I couldn't just run away. I had to end the haunting of this house once and for all by taking away the only thing that gave Julian power over us. As he stepped toward the cowering woman, I lunged forward, not with the knife, but with a heavy iron fire poker I had grabbed from the small, decorative hearth he had installed to make the cellar feel cozy. The sound of the iron clashing against the stone floor was like a bell tolling for the end of our lives, and as Julian turned his cold, blue eyes back to me, I saw that he was finally ready to discard the mask of the doctor and become the butcher he had always been. We were 3 people trapped in a hole in the earth, fighting for a breath of air that Julian thought he owned, and I knew that only one of us was going walking out of that trapdoor alive. The stone walls of the cellar seemed to pulse with the sound of my own blood rushing through my ears, a dark rhythm that told me there was no turning back from this nightmare. The tension was a heavy, invisible hand pressing down on my shoulders as Julian circled us, the needle in his hand glinting like a cold, silver eye that wanted to put my soul to sleep forever. The dark truth was that he didn't see the terror on Sarah's face or the tears in the boy's eyes. He only saw 2 pieces of property that were refusing to stay in their place, and he was ready to break them to keep his secret safe. I held the iron poker with a grip so tight my knuckles turned white, feeling the cold metal vibrate every time Julian's heavy boots hit the floorboards, a slow burn of fear and adrenaline making the air feel electric. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound that had no joy in it, and told me that I was the one who was truly insane, that he had been caring for me while I lived a life of luxury above his head. The tension reached a shivering peak when he lunged at Sarah, his arms swinging wide with the needle, and I realized that he was going to start with her because she was the witness he couldn't control anymore. I didn't think. I just moved, swinging the iron poker with a scream that felt like it had been building up for 20 years of silence and drugged nights. The metal caught him across the shoulder, and I heard the sickening crack of bone, a sound that made the boy let out a high, thin wail that cut through the basement like a knife. Julian stumbled back, his face twisting into a mask of pure, murderous hatred, and for the first time, the perfect doctor looked like the animal he truly was beneath his silk robes. The dark truth hit me that this cellar was designed to keep sound in, which meant no one would hear us dying, and no one would hear the fire that was starting to smolder in my heart. I looked at Sarah, who was frozen in place, and I realized I had to be the one to lead them out of this grave, or we would all become part of the foundation of this cursed Victorian house. The slow burn of the night was reaching its most violent moment, and as Julian gathered himself for another attack, I saw the fear in his eyes, not fear of me, but fear that his masterpiece was finally falling apart. The tension was so thick I could almost taste the dust and the copper in the air, a metallic tang of blood and old secrets that had been hidden too long. I stood my ground, the iron poker heavy in my hands, knowing that every second I kept him busy was a second Sarah had to find the strength to run for the stairs. We were locked in a dance of death in the center of a lie, and as the shadows danced on the walls like hungry ghosts, I knew that the only way to win was to be more terrifying than the monster who had created this hole in the earth. Julian let out a sound that wasn't human, a roar of pure, jagged ego that shook the very foundations of the cellar, and I realized that the man I loved had finally been replaced by the beast he had fed in the dark. The tension was a cold, iron weight in my stomach as he clutched his broken shoulder, his eyes fixed on me with a look so sharp it felt like it could slice my skin open. The dark truth was that he wasn't trying to hide the family anymore. He was trying to eliminate the witness who had dared to turn on the light in his private kingdom. I didn't give him a second to breathe, because I knew that in a fair fight, his size and his cold, calculating mind would eventually crush me. I swung the iron poker again, this time aiming for the shelf of glass jars and medical supplies he kept along the wall, sending a rain of glass and chemicals crashing onto the floor between us. The slow burn of the confrontation had turned into a chaotic explosion of sound and smell, the air filling with the stinging scent of rubbing alcohol and old, stale earth. The tension reached a shivering peak when Julian slipped on the wet glass, his expensive silk robe soaking up the liquids as he scrambled to regain his footing, looking less like a god and more like a cornered rat. I looked at Sarah, who was still huddled in the corner with the boy, and I screamed at her to move, to run for the stairs while the monster was down. The dark truth hit her all at once, the realization that the man who gave her ribbons was the same man who would watch her rot in this hole, and she finally found the strength to stand. She grabbed the boy and bolted toward the stone steps, her feet bare and bleeding on the glass, but she didn't stop because she finally smelled the fresh air coming from the open trapdoor above. Julian saw his collection escaping and let out a scream of pure agony, trying to reach for her ankle with his good hand, but I stepped into his path, the iron poker raised high like a jagged lightning rod. The tension was a snapping wire in the room as our eyes locked one last time, and I saw the moment he realized he had lost everything: his house, his secrets, and the wife he thought he had successfully broken. He lunged for me, his fingers clawing at the air, but I wasn't the drugged, shivering woman of yesterday. I was a fire that had been waiting 20 years for a reason to burn. I pushed over a heavy wooden wardrobe, the massive piece of furniture crashing down on top of his legs with a sound of splintering wood that echoed like a thunderclap in the small space. He was pinned, his face pressed against the cold dirt floor, and as I backed toward the stairs, I saw the needle he had meant for us lying crushed and useless near his hand. The slow burn was over, and the dark truth was that the Victorian monster had finally caught its creator in its own jaws. I climbed the stairs, the yellow light of the cellar fading behind me, and as I reached the parlor, I didn't just close the trapdoor. I pushed the heavy mahogany piano over the top of it, sealing the secrets, the lies, and the man who loved them in the dark where they belonged. The morning sun was just beginning to bleed through the highland fog, but the light felt cold and sharp, like it was cutting through the 20 years of shadows that had lived in my soul. The tension was a humming wire in my brain as I stood in the middle of the parlor, my hands raw and bleeding from pushing the heavy piano, listening to the muffled, frantic scratching coming from beneath the floorboards. The dark truth was that the Victorian house was finally screaming back at Julian, the wood and stone acting as a silencer for a man who had spent his life silencing everyone else. I looked at Sarah and the boy, who were huddled by the front door, their skins so pale they looked like they were made of salt, blinking at the natural light as if it were a physical blow to their eyes. The slow burn of the escape was nearly over, but the air in the house still felt thick with Julian's lingering malice, as if the very wallpaper was soaked in the chemicals he used to keep us quiet. I realized then that I couldn't just walk away and leave this house standing. If the walls remained, the secrets would eventually find a way back out, and I would never be able to sleep without hearing that trapdoor creaking in my dreams. The tension reached a shivering peak when I walked into the kitchen and turned the gas valves on the stove all the way up, the hissing sound filling the room like 1,000 angry snakes. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one deciding how this story would end, and I knew that the only way to truly kill the ghosts of the Highlands was to turn the house into a funeral pyre. The dark truth hit me that by destroying the house, I was destroying the only life I had ever known. But as I looked at the boy reaching out to touch a real leaf through the open door, I knew it was a price I would pay 1,000 times over. I grabbed my coat and a small box of matches, walking out onto the damp grass and feeling the wind for the first time without the heavy weight of Julian's protection on my shoulders. The tension snapped as I struck a single match and tossed it through the open window, watching as the curtains caught fire with a sudden, hungry roar that lit up the gray morning. We sat in the car at the end of the long driveway, watching the Victorian monster turn into a tower of orange flame and black smoke, the heat so intense it cracked the windows of the parlor where my husband was still pinned under his own luxury. The slow burn was finished, and as the roof collapsed into the cellar with a sound like a dying giant, I felt the last of the drug-induced fog lift from my mind forever. Sarah gripped my hand, her fingers trembling but her eyes finally clear, and I realized we weren't just survivors, we were the architects of our own freedom. The dark truth was that the house was never haunted by spirits, it was haunted by a man, and now that the man was Ash, the Highlands were finally, beautifully silent. As we drove away from the fire and toward the city, I didn't look back at the smoke, because for the first time in 20 years, the only thing that mattered was the road ahead and the bright, terrifying, wonderful sun. The road away from the burning estate felt like a bridge between two worlds, and as the orange glow in the rearview mirror faded, I realized that the hardest part of surviving a monster is learning how to live without the cage. The tension was a cold, buzzing vibration in the car, the silence between Sarah, the boy, and me filled with the unspoken weight of 20 years of stolen time and the smell of smoke that clung to our hair like a curse. The dark truth was that while the fire had consumed the stone and the wood, the scars on our souls were still raw and bleeding, and the world outside looked terrifyingly huge and indifferent to the nightmare we had just left behind. I watched the boy stare at the passing trees with a look of pure, silent wonder, his small hands pressed against the glass as if he expected the window to be another painted lie. The slow burn of my adrenaline was finally cooling into a heavy, aching exhaustion, and I had to fight the urge to pull over and scream until my lungs gave out. We reached the city as the sun was high in the sky, a bright and punishing light that made everything feel too loud and too fast, but I knew we couldn't go to the police yet. I had to make sure Sarah and the boy were safe in a place where Julian's shadow could never find them. I took them to a small, hidden motel on the edge of town, a place made of cheap brick and neon lights that felt more like a sanctuary than the Victorian mansion ever had. The tension reached a shivering peak when I saw Sarah look at her own reflection in a real mirror for the first time, her hand trembling as she touched the hollows of her cheeks and the gray strands in her hair that hadn't been there when Julian first took her. The dark truth hit me that we were a family of ghosts trying to remember how to be human, and that the healing Julian promised was something we would have to find in each other, not in a bottle of tonic. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching them sleep in the first real darkness they had known in years, and I realized that the house wasn't the only thing that had to burn. I had to burn the version of Janet that was quiet, obedient, and afraid. The slow burn of my new life was starting right here, in a room that smelled like stale cigarettes and cheap soap, because for the first time in 2 decades, no one was watching me through a crack in the floorboards. The tension finally snapped into a quiet, jagged peace as I realized that Julian was gone, but the strength I found to break him was still inside me, a fire that would never go out. I looked at the morning news on the small TV, seeing the flickering images of the tragedy at the Highland estate, and I smiled a cold, hard smile because I knew the truth was much more powerful than the story they were telling. We were free, and as the city woke up around us, I knew that the silence of the cellar was finally replaced by the beautiful, messy noise of a life that belonged to us and no one else. The motel room felt like a small island in a vast, terrifying ocean, and as I watched the morning light crawl across the stained carpet, I realized that the real haunting was just beginning, the haunting of our own memories. The tension was a cold, sharp needle in my spine because even though the house was ash, I kept expecting to hear the heavy click of a lock or the smell of Julian's expensive cologne drifting through the vents. The dark truth was that 20 years of being a prisoner had rewired my brain to find safety in the dark, and the open air of the city felt like a threat I didn't know how to fight. I looked at the small pile of money I had snatched from the safe before the fire, realizing it was the only thing we had left to build a wall between us and the past. The slow burn of our survival was shifting into a desperate game of hide and seek with a world that wouldn't understand how a doctor could be a monster and a wife could be a ghost. I watched Sarah try to eat a piece of bread, her movements slow and robotic, her eyes constantly darting toward the door as if she expected Julian to burst through it with a needle and a smile. The tension reached a shivering peak when a police siren wailed in the distance, and all three of us froze, our hearts beating in a synchronized rhythm of pure, unadulterated terror. I realized then that we couldn't just hide. We had to disappear before the investigators found the bones in the cellar and started asking questions that would lead them back to us. The dark truth hit me that the world would see me as a murderer for burning that house, not a savior, because the law likes its victims to stay quiet and its monsters to stay in the light. I had to become the person Julian feared most, a woman who knew how to hide in plain sight, using the very tricks he taught me to keep us invisible. The slow burn of the afternoon was a blur of buying cheap clothes, changing our hair, and scrubbing the smell of smoke from our skin until it was red and raw. The tension was a snapping wire as I realized the boy had never seen a car from the inside before, and every bump in the road made him flinch like he was being struck. I whispered to them that we were going to a place where the sun never went out, a place where the grass was real and the walls didn't have ears. But even as I said it, I could feel the cold weight of the silver carving knife in my bag. The dark truth was that I would never truly be at peace until I knew for certain that every trace of Julian's legacy was wiped from the earth, and that meant we could never look back, not even for a second. We left the motel as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the pavement, and as I pulled onto the highway, I felt the vast, empty space of the future opening up in front of us like a void. The tension was a quiet, steady hum in the engine as we drove toward the border, three broken people held together by a secret that was too heavy for the world to carry. The highway stretched out before us like an endless black ribbon, cutting through a landscape that felt as lonely and haunted as the house we had left in ashes. The tension inside the car was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating cloud that made every breath feel like I was inhaling jagged glass. The dark truth was that even though we were miles away from the highlands, I could still feel Julian's influence crawling under my skin, a phantom itch that told me a man who had successfully hidden a family for 20 years wouldn't disappear just because the walls had fallen. Every time a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, my heart would lurch into my throat, and I would find my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal, desperate to outrun a shadow that didn't have a face. I looked over at Sarah, who was staring out at the passing gas stations and neon signs with the wide, unblinking eyes of someone who had forgotten that the world was this loud and bright. The slow burn of her trauma was beginning to show in the way she flinched at the sound of the windshield wipers, her hands constantly checking the locks on the door as if the wind itself might reach in and pull her back into the dark. We pulled into a rest stop near the border, the air smelling of diesel and old coffee, and the tension reached a shivering peak when I saw a man in a long coat standing by the payphones, his back turned to us in a way that looked exactly like Julian. My blood turned to ice, and for a split second, I was back in the parlor, hearing the heavy thud of the trapdoor, convinced that the monster had somehow crawled out of the fire and followed us across the state line. The dark truth hit me that we were never going to be safe as long as we were looking for him in every stranger's face, but I also knew that a predator like Julian always had a backup plan, a safety net woven from the lies he told the world. I watched the boy sleep in the back seat, his face finally peaceful, and the rage I felt was a cold, sharp blade that kept me from collapsing into the exhaustion that was screaming in my bones. I realized that if we were going to survive, I had to stop running like a victim and start thinking like the woman who had smashed a doctor's world with a frying pan and a match. The slow burn of the night was turning into a gray, misty dawn, and as we crossed the border into a new state, the tension shifted from fear into a grim, silent resolve. I looked at the map, seeing a small town tucked away in the mountains where nobody knew the name of the famous doctor or his fragile wife, and I knew that was where we would make our stand. The dark truth was that the fire hadn't ended the story. It had just moved the stage, and as I drove into the rising sun, I felt the heavy weight of the silver knife in my bag, a constant reminder that the only person who could truly protect us was the one who had finally learned how to kill. The small mountain town was swallowed by a thick, gray mist that felt far too much like the highlands, and as I pulled the car into the gravel driveway of a secluded cabin, I realized that you can change your name, but you can never change the way your heart jumps at a sudden noise. The tension was a cold, wet blanket draped over us as we stepped out into the biting air, the silence of the woods feeling like a trap waiting to spring. The dark truth was that the quiet here wasn't peaceful. It was a void that invited the echoes of Julian's voice back into my head, whispering that I was weak and that I would eventually come crawling back to the safety of his cage. I watched Sarah walk toward the cabin, her steps hesitant and shaky, as she looked at the towering pine trees as if they were the bars of a new, much larger prison. The slow burn of our arrival was interrupted by the sudden sound of a branch snapping in the woods behind us, and the tension reached a shivering peak that made my skin crawl with the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. I gripped the door handle of the cabin, my eyes scanning the dark treeline, wondering if Julian had friends in high places or secret properties I never knew about during our 20 years of perfect marriage. The dark truth hit me that a man like him didn't just build one cellar, he built a network of control, and we were currently standing in the middle of a wilderness where a body could disappear for 100 years and never be found. Inside the cabin, the air was stale and smelled of dust and old wood, a smell that triggered a flash of memory so violent I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. I saw the boy sit on the floor and start playing with a smooth stone he had found, his silence more heartbreaking than any scream, because it showed he was still waiting for someone to tell him when he was allowed to breathe. The tension was a low, steady hum in the room as I began to cover the windows with heavy blankets, turning the beautiful view into a dark, safe box that felt familiar in the worst way possible. I realized then that I was recreating the very environment I had fought to escape, turning myself into the jailer just to keep the world away from us. The slow burn of the evening turned into a night of watching the door with the silver knife in my lap, the shadows of the trees dancing on the walls like 1,000 Julians coming to take back what was theirs. The dark truth was that we weren't just running from a man, we were running from the part of ourselves that still felt like we belonged to him. I looked at the flickering candle on the table and knew that if a car drove up that path tonight, I wouldn't hide in the parlor. I would meet the monster at the gate and finish what the fire started. The tension remained like a coiled snake in the corner of the room, and as the wind began to howl through the mountain pass, I realized that the real battle wasn't over. It was just waiting for the sun to go down so the real ghosts could come out to play. The cabin felt like a wooden lung, breathing in the cold mountain air and exhaling the scent of our shared terror. And as the clock on the wall ticked like a countdown, I realized that freedom isn't the absence of a cage, it's the strength to stop looking for the bars. The tension was a jagged glass wall between me and the sleep I so desperately needed, my eyes burning as I stared at the heavy wooden door, waiting for the sound of a key that shouldn't exist. The dark truth was that Julian's power didn't come from his locks or his drugs. It came from the way he made me believe I was a victim even when I was holding the weapon. I looked at Sarah, who was sitting by the cold hearth, her fingers tracing the scars on her wrists with a rhythmic, haunting precision that told me she was still living in the cellar in her mind. The slow burn of the night was shattered when the boy suddenly pointed toward the frosted window and whispered that he saw a man in a white coat standing in the trees, a ghost of the doctor come to collect his due. The tension reached a shivering peak that made the very air feel like ice, and I lunged for the flashlight, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I threw the beam of light into the darkness of the forest. There was nothing there but the swaying shadows of the pines and the swirling mist, but the dark truth hit me that the monster didn't need to be physically present to destroy us. He had planted his seeds of fear so deep that we were doing his work for him. I realized that as long as we stayed in this cabin, hiding behind blankets and shivering at every snap of a twig, we were still his prisoners, just in a different location. The slow burn of my fear turned into a sharp, hot needle of defiance as I walked over to the windows and ripped down the blankets, letting the pale moonlight flood into the room and expose every corner of our hiding place. The tension was a snapping cord as Sarah gasped, but I told her that we weren't going to live in the dark anymore, and if Julian was out there, he could see exactly where we were and come face the fire he had started. The dark truth was that the only way to kill a shadow is to shine a light so bright it has nowhere left to hide, and I was done being a shadow in my own life. I spent the rest of the night cleaning the cabin, my movements fast and aggressive, scrubbing away the dust of our fear until the wood shone like bone under the moon. The tension remained, but it was different now. It was the tension of a hunter waiting for the prey to make a move, a cold and calculated readiness that felt more like Julian than I wanted to admit. I looked at the boy and promised him that tomorrow we would go to the police, that we would tell the story until the whole world knew the name of the man who lived under the floorboards, and that no matter what happened, we would never go back to the highlands. The slow burn of the night ended with the first orange light of dawn hitting the mountain peaks, and as I stood on the porch, I felt the heavy weight of the past finally starting to slide off my shoulders. We were three people who had survived the grave, and as the sun rose, I knew that the dark truth was finally simple. We were alive, he was ash, and the world was finally ours to take. The morning sun felt like a cold interrogation lamp as we walked into the local police station, the smell of floor wax and stale coffee hitting me with a wave of reality that was more terrifying than the silence of the woods. The tension was a tight, vibrating wire in my chest as I stood at the front desk, my hands trembling as I clutched the small bag containing the silver carving knife and the empty vials of Julian's medicine. The dark truth was that coming into the light meant exposing our wounds to a world that might not believe a respected doctor could be a monster. And I could feel the eyes of the officers crawling over our ragged clothes and hollow faces like they were looking at ghosts. I watched the sheriff, a man with a face like cracked leather, listen to my story with a slow, skeptical blink that made the air in the room feel thin and freezing. The slow burn of the interview was a nightmare of repeating the same impossible details: the hidden door, the 20 years of drugs, the family in the dirt, until the words began to sound like a lie even to my own ears. The tension reached a shivering peak when the sheriff leaned forward and asked why there were no records of Sarah or the boy ever existing. And for a heartbeat, the dark truth hit me that Julian hadn't just stolen their lives. He had erased their very identities from the face of the earth. I looked at Sarah, who was sitting on a hard plastic chair with the boy, her face a mask of frozen terror as she realized that without proof, we were just three lunatics who had burned down a historic mansion in the middle of the night. The slow burn of the investigation turned into a frantic race as the officers began making calls to the highlands, and the tension in the room snapped when the news came back that the ruins of our house had been searched and they had found the remains of the secret cellar. The dark truth was finally coming out, but it brought no comfort. Instead, it felt like the walls were closing in again as the sheriff told us that they had found something else in the ashes, something that shouldn't have been there. My heart stopped as he laid a charred metal box on the table, a box that Julian had kept in a separate safe I never knew about, filled with photographs of other women and other children who had disappeared over the last 30 years. The tension was a crushing weight as I realized that we weren't just survivors of a single crime. We were the only witnesses to a lifetime of systematic horror that stretched across the entire country. The slow burn of my grief turned into a sharp, jagged resolve because I knew that Julian's death in the fire wasn't enough to pay for the rows of faces staring back at me from the scorched photos. I looked at the sheriff and told him that if he wanted the truth, he had to stop looking for a doctor and start looking for a graveyard, because the Victorian estate was just the beginning of Julian's map of shadows. The tension remained, a cold and permanent companion, as the police station transformed from a place of safety into the command center for a hunt that would change everything I thought I knew about the man I married. We were free from the house, but the dark truth was that we were now the lead characters in a horror story that the world would never forget, and the light of the sun was only making the shadows of the past look longer and more dangerous than ever before. The charred metal box sat on the police table like a cursed heart, and as the sheriff pulled out the ruined photographs, the tension in the room turned into a cold, suffocating fog that made it hard to swallow. The dark truth was that Julian hadn't just been a jailer, he had been a collector of lives, a man who treated human souls like butterflies pinned to a board, and I was simply the latest centerpiece in a gallery of stolen breath. Each photo showed a different face, women with bright smiles and children with messy hair, all of them now reduced to gray shadows in the ashes of a monster's pride. The slow burn of the realization hit me like a physical blow, making my stomach churn as I realized that the ghosts I had heard in the walls for 20 years might not have been a drugged hallucination after all, but the echoes of those who came before us and didn't make it out. The tension reached a shivering peak when the sheriff pointed to a photograph of a young girl from the 1990s and asked Sarah if she recognized her. And the sound that came out of Sarah's throat was a low, jagged moan of recognition that made the hair on my arms stand up. She whispered a name I didn't know, a name that belonged to a sister she had forgotten she even had, and the dark truth was finally laid bare. Julian had been hunting within the same bloodlines, weaving a web of trauma that spanned generations. I felt a sudden, sharp surge of cold fury that burned away my exhaustion, because I realized that the fire I started hadn't just been an act of survival. It had been an act of delayed justice for 100 silent voices. The slow burn of the investigation intensified as the police began to realize that the Victorian mansion was built over an older foundation, a labyrinth of stone and secrets that might hold more than just ash and memories. The tension was a snapping wire as I watched the boy reach out and touch a photo of a woman who looked exactly like him, his small face twisting with a confusion that was too heavy for a child to carry. We were sitting in a room filled with the evidence of a lifetime of evil, and the dark truth hit me that the world would never be the same for us, because we were the only ones who knew the sound of the monster's footsteps and the taste of his poisoned tea. I looked at the silver carving knife sitting in the evidence bag and felt a strange, hollow sense of regret, not for what I did, but for the fact that I hadn't done it 20 years sooner. The tension remained like a ghost in the corner of the room, a reminder that even though the man was dead, the map of his crimes was still being unfolded, piece by bloody piece. I told the sheriff that if he wanted to find the rest of them, he had to stop looking at the house and start looking at the places Julian traveled to consult, the clinics and hospitals where he was treated like a god while he was scouting for his next victim. The slow burn of the afternoon turned into a night of statements and fingerprints, but as I looked at Sarah and the boy, I knew that the dark truth was finally our shield. We were the witnesses that Julian never thought would find the light, and now we were the ones who would make sure his name was dragged through the dirt until there was nothing left but the truth. The walls of the police station began to feel like the cellar all over again as the news of the investigation spread, and the tension was a cold, sharp blade pressing against my throat when the sheriff told us that the accidental fire was being reclassified as a crime scene of national importance. The dark truth was that Julian's reach went deeper than a single house in the Highlands. He had been a ghost moving through the medical world for decades, and as his secrets were unearthed, the air in the room felt thick with the weight of all the people who had trusted him and paid with their lives. I sat in a small, windowless office while experts in white suits examined the silver knife, and the slow burn of my anxiety reached a shivering peak when they revealed that the metal was stained with a cocktail of drugs that shouldn't exist outside of a high-security lab. This meant Julian wasn't just a lonely monster. He was a man with connections, a predator who had been protected by a system that preferred a clean reputation over a messy truth. The tension reached a breaking point when Sarah suddenly stood up and pointed at a man walking down the hallway, her scream so high and thin it sounded like a whistle, claiming she recognized his eyes from the nights Julian had visitors in the dark. The dark truth hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Julian hadn't been acting alone, and the family he was building downstairs might have been part of a sick, private market for people who wanted to play God with other humans. The slow burn of our escape was now a full-blown war, and as the police scrambled to lock down the station, I realized that the forest cabin hadn't been a sanctuary, but a target for anyone who wanted to keep Julian's wider network a secret. I gripped the boy's hand so hard it must have hurt, my eyes darting toward the exits as I realized that the safety of the law was just another layer of the maze Julian had trapped us in. The tension was a snapping cord when the lights in the station suddenly flickered and died, plunging us into a thick, synthetic darkness that smelled of ozone and old, hidden rot. I didn't wait for the backup generators to kick in. I grabbed Sarah and the boy, moving through the shadows with the predatory grace I had learned from watching Julian for 20 years. The dark truth was that the fire at the estate hadn't burned the monster away. It had only poked a hole in a hornet's nest of powerful, faceless men who couldn't afford to let us testify. The slow burn of the night was replaced by a frantic, silent escape through the backloading docks, our hearts drumming a rhythm of pure survival as we realized the hunt was no longer about one man in a silk robe, but about an entire world of secrets that wanted us silenced. I saw a black car idling at the edge of the parking lot, its headlights off like the eyes of a shark, and the tension in my chest became a cold, hard knot of resolve. I wasn't just a wife anymore, and I wasn't just a witness. I was the loose thread that could unravel a whole tapestry of evil, and I would burn the entire world down before I let them put us back in a cage. The parking lot was a sea of shifting shadows and the smell of wet asphalt, and the tension was a cold, jagged knife in my ribs as we sprinted toward the old car I had parked in the furthest corner of the lot. The dark truth was that the police station, the place that was supposed to be our fortress, had turned into just another room in Julian's endless house of horrors, and the men in the black car were the cleaners sent to make sure the evidence was finally buried for good. I threw Sarah and the boy into the backseat, the slow burn of my fear transforming into a sharp, electric clarity that made the world move in slow motion as the black car's engine roared to life with a predatory growl. The tension reached a shivering peak when the first bullet shattered my side mirror, the sound like a whip crack in the silent night, and I realized that these people didn't care about the truth or the law. They only cared about the silence that Julian had maintained for 30 years. I slammed the car into gear, my tires screaming against the pavement as I swerved around the exit, the dark truth hitting me that we were now the most dangerous people on the planet because we were the only ones who knew the names of the guests who had visited the cellar. The slow burn of the chase through the winding mountain roads was a blur of white-knuckled terror and blinding headlights, the black car clinging to our bumper like a shadow that refused to be shaken by the dawn. I looked at Sarah in the rearview mirror and saw a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there when she was cowering in the dirt, a jagged edge of survival that told me she was finally ready to fight back against the men who had treated her like a specimen. The tension was a snapping wire as I intentionally veered toward the edge of a steep ravine, forcing the black car to swerve and lose its momentum, the metal of our vehicles scraping together with a shower of orange sparks that lit up the forest like a dying star. The dark truth was that Julian had taught me how to be cold, how to be calculated, and how to hide my intentions until it was too late for the victim to scream, and now I was using every one of his lessons to kill the legacy he had left behind. We reached a narrow bridge over a rushing river, and the tension reached its ultimate boiling point as I slammed on the brakes, the black car skidding to a halt behind us, trapped between my steel and the narrow stone walls. I didn't wait for them to step out. I grabbed the heavy flare gun I had taken from the police evidence room and fired it directly into the leaking fuel line of the black car, watching as the night turned into a blinding, beautiful explosion of heat and light. The slow burn of the conspiracy was finally meeting its match in the fire of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and as the black car tumbled into the river like a falling comet, I knew the message was sent. The basement was closed and the toys were now the hunters. We stood on the bridge, the heat of the fire warming our faces, and as the smoke rose toward the stars, I felt the last chord of Julian's influence snap inside my heart, leaving me with a cold, hard peace that was more powerful than any drug. The dark truth was that we were still on the run, but for the first time in 20 years, the people behind us were the ones who were afraid, and the sun was finally rising on a world where we were no longer ghosts. The sun finally broke over the horizon, a sharp, golden blade that cut through the mountain mist and officially ended the longest night of our lives. The tension that had lived in my bones for 20 years didn't disappear, but it changed from the heavy weight of a victim into the steady, cold armor of a survivor. The dark truth was that the Victorian mansion was gone, the black car was at the bottom of the river, and the name Julian was now nothing more than a stain on the history of the Highlands. I stood at the edge of the cliff with Sarah and the boy, watching the smoke from the bridge fire drift away, and for the first time, the air didn't taste like Julian's chemicals or the damp rot of a cellar. It tasted like pine, salt, and absolute terrifying freedom. We knew the fight wasn't over. There were still names in that metal box and men in high places who would look for us, but the slow burn of our fear had been forged into a fire that would never be put out again. I looked at the boy who was squinting at the sun, and I realized he would grow up in a world where walls were made of wood, not secrets, and where a closed door was just a door, not a sentence. The dark truth hit me that I could never go back to the Janet I was before the tonic and the hidden room, but as I gripped the steering wheel and headed toward a horizon that finally belonged to me, I knew that the woman I had become was someone Julian could never have controlled. We were three ghosts who had clawed our way back to the land of the living, and as the miles stretched out behind us, the silence in the car was no longer empty. It was full of the plans, the dreams, and the loud, messy life that was waiting for us. Before I finish this final chapter of our journey, my dear friends, I want to thank you for sticking with me through the shadows. If you felt the tension of the cellar and the heat of the fire, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can share more of these dark mysteries together. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these stories alive. Drop a comment below to let me know if you think Janet ever truly felt safe again. In end, it's clear that the light doesn't just show you the monsters, it shows you the way home. We drove into the bright, shimmering distance, leaving the Victorian ghost story behind us forever, finally free to breathe in a world that was no longer hidden beneath the floorboards.